Good evening. Welcome to Mental Health, Wellness, and Recovery. I'm Richard Weingarten, and I'll be your host for tonight's program on how our democratic institutions are holding up so far. With the 2024 elections on the horizon, many people have shown real concern about this November's presidential election. President Joe Biden, at 81, is the oldest sitting American president. Many people think he is too old for the job. On the Republican side, former President Donald Trump, age 77, will be the likely candidate. Faced with 4 criminal indictments on 91 counts, the former president would be the first president in United States history to be formally indicted. Furthermore, former President Trump has stated publicly that, if elected, he'll be a dictator on day one. The former president has also stated that if he's elected for a second term of office, he'll use the Justice Department for political purposes and will purge government workers in the so-called deep state. He has said he will replace them with people loyal to him. He has also said that he'll pardon the people who were tried and convicted of participating in the storming of the Capitol on January 6, 2020. Many people saw this mob riot as an effort to overturn the Electoral College vote and prevent the peaceful transfer of power. Many of the attackers have been brought to justice and imprisoned. And many people saw former President Trump's unwillingness to accept the results of the 2020 election and his support of the participants in the January 6 riot as further challenges to our democratic system of government. While many people saw the political violence on January 6 as unprecedented, it really wasn't. If we look back 50 years or so, the country saw much political violence in the 1960s. President John F. Kennedy was assassinated in 1963. The black leader, Malcolm X, was killed in 1965. Then, in 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated, which prompted massive protests across the country. Bobby Kennedy, who was then a presidential candidate, was also assassinated in 1968. With me tonight to discuss what went on in the United States in the tumultuous period of the late 1960s and early 70s, and to compare it with what has gone on since 2016, which I'll call the Trump era, is Dr. Kevin J. McMahon, the John R. Reitmeyer Professor of Political Science at Trinity College. Dr. McMahon, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
In your opinion, was the violence in the U.S. in 1968 greater than the violence we've seen in the Trump era?
Yeah, so I've written a paper on this comparison between the 1960s and late 1960s, early 1970s, and the Trump era, beginning in 2016 and obviously continuing to today. And what I'm trying to there's been a lot of conversation in political circles and certainly in newspapers and news outlets about this threat to democracy that Trump poses. So what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to identify ways in which we might compare the 1960s, which is often thought as a period of great democracy, right, where you have all these movements, the civil rights movement, the gay rights movement, the women's movement, who are rising up and trying to express their own opinions to establish new rights, newly won rights. So to what extent do we have greater democracy today or then, right? Conventional wisdom tells us that it was then and not today. And so if we look at political violence as one of the indicators, as you've listed already, the late 1960s, early 1970s was a period of great unrest, a lot of violence. You have the assassination of some of those key figures, both on the left, and you also have the attempted assassination of George Wallace while he's running for president.
That's right. That was in 1972, wasn't it?
Correct.
He ran against McGovern, right?
He was, as a conservative Democrat, right? Mm-hmm. So he's running in the Democratic primary, having run as an independent candidate in 1968. So you have You have various revolutionary groups that are carrying out various activities. You have urban unrest, a lot of violence in the streets. Some scholars like Elizabeth Hinton at Yale argue that this urban unrest are really revolutions, right? Forms of political violence. So when you compare that violence, actual violence, to today, while certainly something like January 6th is a very scary thing,
Yeah.
It's a little different in terms of the numbers.
But what about the killing of George Floyd and what came after that?
Right. Sure. Yeah. You do have certainly protests after George Floyd. They are certainly politically inspired. But again, if you look to Elizabeth Hinton's work, she really sees a clear distinction between the unrest that was occurring in the late 1960s, and the post George Floyd protests.
Mm-hmm. The George Floyd protests were mostly peaceful, weren't they?
Yeah, I think for the most part. There's certainly times when there was some arrests and some violence, but largely they were widespread. Right, a lot of communities had protests, but oftentimes, and certainly in my understanding, there wasn't much violence.
Mm-hmm. Now let's look at voter participation in 1968 as opposed to 2020.
Right.
What do those voters tell us about Americans wanting to participate and engage in the democratic process?
Yeah, so one key thing that you have in the 60s is a change in the Constitution, right? The 26th Amendment allows 18-year-olds to vote. So in terms of looking at the numbers of voter participation, you're going to see a little bit of a dip then, just because you have more people who are new voters who may not come to the polls right away. But if you can, so it's pretty similar if you look at voter turnout in the 1968 presidential election, 1972 presidential election compared to 2016, 2020. But what we're seeing, the total number of voters is now about 50% of the adult population. That's much higher than it was in the 1960s.
Mm-hmm.
So
it's sort of at record heights, isn't it?
Yeah,
I mean, it hasn't gotten this much people out since 1900 or something, right?
That's right. Yeah. So one thing, as Trump is often seen as hostile to democracy, as you've laid out. Certainly says things like that, and has during his presidency carried out various actions that display that as well. But he's mobilized, right? He's mobilized. One of his key strategies is to mobilize individuals who in the past were apathetic, who may have been conservative but didn't show up at the polls. They weren't motivated to go out and vote for somebody like Mitt Romney or John McCain, but Trump has really brought those individuals out. So, we tend to think of greater voter participation as a good thing for democracy, not a bad thing.
Mm-hmm. Former President Donald Trump has also been accused of political corruption. However, in 1973 and 74, President Richard Nixon was embroiled in the Watergate scandal. As we know, President Nixon was forced to resign to escape his impeachment by a bipartisan congressional committee. The committee was investigating his role in the Watergate break-in and in other crimes,
right?
Which they called dirty tricks, didn't they? Yeah. Now, is there any way of comparing what President Nixon's Watergate scandal with former President Trump's impeachment and the 4 indictments that he will be prosecuted for?
Yeah, so if we look at that, oftentimes the story about Watergate is, you hear the line, the cover-up is worse than the crime, mm-hmm. right? Mm-hmm. But in a new history of the Watergate scandal that was recently published by a journalist, he essentially argues that this is not true, right? That's not the correct version or the correct telling of what happened in Watergate. That the Watergate break-in was really the last of a series of events, these dirty trick events, manufactured by Nixon and his people to really, undermine democracy, right? So if we compare those series of events to what's happening with Donald Trump, In the case of Richard Nixon, he was certainly identified as an unindicted co-conspirator by the special prosecutor Jaworski. But as you know, soon after he left the White House, his own appointed vice president, right, Gerald Ford, was not on the ticket in 1972 because Spiro Agnew also was in a different scandal, and so forced from the vice presidency. Mm-hmm. So Ford becomes vice president, and soon thereafter, I think it's about 40 days or so, he pardons Nixon's of all crimes, right? So Nixon is allowed to basically go off into the sunset, if you will, and slowly rebuild back his political reputation. Not fully, but he does restore it to some extent. Compare that to Donald Trump, as you alluded to earlier. You know, he's undergoing 4 prosecutions, 91 indictments, other trials that deal with his company, right? The Trump Organization. So this, to me, is not a democracy that's dying, as some people allege. It is really what's going on in these trials is it is about the power of the democratic institutions in the United States who are trying to ensure that this individual who, again, many people are concerned with his commitment to democratic institutions. They are making sure that he is held to the same standards as under other individuals, that he's not above the law. Again, I see that as a strength of democracy, not a weakness.
Mm-hmm. Don't you think that the judiciary has really responded to the challenges of Donald Trump when he thought that the elections were rigged? Didn't they have like 62 different courts came back and said that no, they were free and fair elections? Yeah,
so certainly in that case, if we focus on the Supreme Court specifically, they had no interest in taking up any electoral challenge to whether it's Pennsylvania or Arizona, those states, Georgia, that Trump was suggesting had problems with their vote count, so there was no interest. In the case of these more recent trials, some of these cases are still developing, right? There's a decision today about presidential immunity where the Federal Appeals Court denied Trump's claim that he was immune from any charges. That's likely going to go to the Supreme Court. This is a real question for the Supreme Court, right? This is a Supreme Court filled with 6 Republican appointees, 3 Democratic appointees. 3 of those 6 were Trump justices.
Yeah.
Right. So how is that court going to respond to these arguments? If we look back to Nixon again, the court. One justice recused himself because he had been in the Nixon Justice Department previously, but it was an 8-0 decision. This is the U.S. v. Nixon decision. 8-0 decision, and essentially this is what ends Nixon's presidency. He resigns just a few days after that decision is announced.
Yeah. America's democratic institutions are based on our Bill of Rights, or our basic freedoms, the right to free speech, to free assembly, to practice the religion of your choice, to run for political office. I found that these freedoms are often taken for granted by American citizens. As you and I know, many countries do not grant or uphold these freedoms for their citizens. You worked in Russia in the 1990s when then President Boris Yeltsin was trying to make Russia into a democratic country. What did you see there? What did you find in terms of people's freedoms? I imagine that Yeltsin was trying to increase people's freedoms and give them a sense of empowerment, that they were full-fledged citizens, had a right to vote, had a right to select their candidates, had a right to run for office themselves. What was it that you did there, and what did you see in terms of the freedoms that Russians had or didn't have?
Yeah. So I was there for 2 academic years from 1994 to 1996, and I was there with an organization called the Civic Education Project, which the nickname for it was the Academic Peace Corps. So I was an advanced graduate student working on a dissertation and teaching at Russian universities to Russian students, right? What I saw, and this is a period of, where you're transitioning, the Soviet Union ends in December of 1991, so just a few years after that, right? So you're transitioning from what was a failed state, a failed authoritarian regime, and this attempt.
This is the Soviet Union.
The
right?
Soviet Union,
Mm-hmm.
right? So now Russia is attempting, just like many of the other Central European, Eastern European countries are going through the same transition, trying to become a democracy. And what I saw was a lot of chaos, right? That it was, you could see physical violence in the street. You heard stories of people having their apartments just taken away by mafiosa.
You mean
Russian
the mafia would come in and kick the people out and they'd stay there? There was no recourse for the people that lost their homes?
That's right. So people would just come and, often with guns and just say it's time for you to leave your apartment. And there was no recourse, right? So this is part of the reason why somebody like Putin had some appeal in the late 90s when I shouldn't say Putin specifically, but sort of an appeal for a strongman, right, to come in because the country wasn't working. And democracy was being defined not for these great rights that you've identified, but for this failed state, right? That's what democracy meant to many Russians. But you also saw, individuals who were trying to express freedom of the press or freedom of speech, just being unable to do so. And it wasn't necessarily that the state was acting in a way, but that these independent authorities, usually the Russian mafia, are acting in a way to make sure people stayed in line.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned earlier in our conversation that a lot of the state-owned businesses were taken over by private parties.
Yeah.
And this led to a kind of oligarchy. How did that have any kind of impact on individual freedoms or the political process in the country?
Yeah. Well, I think it is part of the responsibility of why there's a sense among certainly the Russians I knew that they saw great hope in the idea of democracy and the possibilities of democracy. But as it became, at least in their eyes, a government of rich individuals where, friends of Yeltsin or friends of the state were enriching themselves. So that to them, that was what was defining democracy, not in the same types of ideals or rights that you've listed. It was this distorted view of democracy, because that's what they were seeing before their eyes.
Yeah, I too lived in a country where individual freedoms were non-existent. I was in Brazil as a Peace Corps volunteer in the late 60s, and then in the early 70s, I was a foreign news correspondent for United Press International in Rio de Janeiro. At that time, Brazil was ruled by military dictatorship. On several occasions when I worked the night shift, parents of Brazilian university students would come to the UPI office and tell us stories of their sons or daughters who had disappeared because of their political activities at the university. They wanted the stories of their missing children to be told. However, UPI had a rule. Stories like this could only be told and only be written up if the parents gave their names. And the parents were afraid to identify themselves because the government would come out against them in some sort of, violent way. And sadly, we could not tell or write up their stories. However, I had a daring colleague at UPI who did a series of articles on the death squads in Rio and Sao Paulo. The death squads were made up of off-duty policemen who killed petty criminals and political dissidents for the government. My colleague, Diana, bravely signed her name to these articles. Then she ran a story about a university student who was tortured and killed by the military. The family that told her this story had an uncle in the United States who was a federal judge. The family felt safe telling Diana the tragic story of their murdered son. And Diana signed her name to this article also. Well, I should tell you that the military government did not want critical articles about Brazil published outside Brazil or abroad. They wanted Brazil's reputation to go untarnished so that foreign investors would continue investing in the Brazilian economy.
Mm-hmm.
At that time, the economy was growing about 6% a year. It was considered a miracle. Well, some months later, I was house sitting for Diana in Ipanema, and Diana was on vacation in northeast Brazil. Then one Saturday morning, I heard a loud banging on the door of her apartment. When I opened it, 3 police officers barged in, one carrying a Uzi machine gun and 2 others with handguns. They had a search warrant for Diana's apartment. She had been accused of being a drug dealer. That's what I found out. Well, they searched their apartment quite thoroughly, and while they were going through Diana's drawers and closets, I whispered to the cleaning lady, "I'm going to be taken in for questioning. Please call the UPI Bureau and tell them to send a lawyer to get me out of jail." Well, thankfully, she did. Well, I was told to go with the policemen and marched out with them. I was put in a paddy wagon with a policeman holding the gun in my face. On the way to the police narcotics precinct, the policeman stopped at 2 favelas. Favelas are shanty towns on the hills of Rio de Janeiro. Well, they picked up 2 real drug dealers at those stops, and when we got to the police station, we were marched to the entrance of the precinct. Well, thank God, the UPI business manager and lawyer were walking towards us in the opposite direction. The business manager had been on a censorship committee with the police chiefs. He knew him personally, and the lawyer was there to help out getting me out of custody. Well, I was marched into a room, and I was being interviewed by a man at a typewriter. He was asking me, "Where's Diana?" I said, "I don't know where she is," and so he was asking me a lot of questions. And while he was typing out the answers, I saw a dossier on the table with Diana's name on it. So I picked up the dossier, and the guy was busy typing, so I was looking through it, and I found out that she was identified by a couple of hippie guys who were in jail. To get out of jail, they had to name people who were in their circle dealing drugs, and they gave Diana's name. Well, I thought, geez, that's pretty bad. They're going to come after Diana. And so after a while, I was let out, and I went with the business manager and the lawyer back to Diana's apartment. The editor of UPI met us at the apartment, and he called Diana and told her what had happened to me and that she needed to leave the country immediately. So he got word to her that she met him at the Rio airport in the dead of night. We packed a couple of suitcases up full of her clothes. The editor met with her and then gave her the suitcases, and then early the next morning she left Brazil for New York. So she was out of it without any problem. And nothing further happened to me either.
Mm-hmm.
But this was something that occurred in the newsroom too. We had a guy in the newsroom whose father, a Brazilian fellow, whose father was a colonel in the army. And he would stand behind us while we were writing stories, and he would say, that story is a negative story about Brazil. Now you've got to write a positive story. Well, we didn't listen to him because it was an American news bureau and we were protected by UPI. But oftentimes he'd stop us. He'd come back when I was doing some photo editing with the photo editor, and we were showing cows on a road in northeast Brazil where there was a famine and a severe drought. The cows were lying down dead on the road with their ribs sticking out. And he'd look over our shoulder and say, that's not the reality of Brazil. You've got to send different pictures. Mm-hmm. Well, we ignored him too. But there was that kind of tension there.
Sure.
And that at that time in the early 70s, people were very afraid to talk. Mm-hmm. There were channels by which you could do political stories. There were certain parties that were sponsored by the military government who would tell you what's happening politically. Mm-hmm. The same thing was true with economic stories. You couldn't write an economic story critical of what was going on in Brazil. Mm-hmm. If you did, you got into serious trouble.
Yeah.
Anyway, that was kind of the pressure that we were on at that time in Brazil, sending out stories to the rest of the world. You mentioned also that in your experience in the Russian years that you were there, that there was some difficulty with people publishing magazines and news stories,
Yeah.
and not having those allowed by the government. Could you go into that a little bit, please?
Yeah. So there was, when I first arrived, and the first city I was in was Yekaterinburg, which is one of the largest cities in Russia, just over the Ural Mountains, and a former student was arrested, and for basically, from what we understood, he was arrested for what he had published in a newspaper, and he ended up dying in jail. So,
Wow.
and some people thought it was said that he committed suicide, but some people thought that it wasn't actually the case.
Yeah, that's very sad, and those kinds of stories don't come out. Well, I see our time is about up. I want to thank you very much for coming on the show tonight and talking about these political events of the late 60s, early 70s, and how they compared to what's going on now. Really appreciate your being with me tonight. I hope our viewers have enjoyed the show also, and I'll be back next month with another story on mental health, wellness, and recovery. Thank you so much.